Abandoned as a boy, the old veteran returned to his cabin. What he built there became a paradise. If stories of quiet courage warm your heart, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts by the fire, and maybe yours is one of them. There are places that hold memory the way snow holds footprints, light and temporary, until the wind decides otherwise. The cabin sat at the end of a road that had forgotten its own name, buried beneath decades of pine needles and silence. And when the old veteran stepped from his truck that winter afternoon, the cold had a sound to it, a high, thin hum that lived somewhere between the trees and the sky. He stood there for a long time, one hand still resting on the door, the other hanging empty at his side, and he did not move, because moving meant admitting he had truly come back, and admitting meant remembering, and remembering was the heaviest work of all. The mountains rose around him like the walls of a church built by something older than men, their peaks white and distant, their silence absolute. He had been a boy here once, small and hungry, left behind by a father who never learned how to stay, and a mother whose face he could no longer picture clearly, though sometimes he dreamed her hands, gentle, tired, always cold. The cabin had been theirs, or maybe it had never belonged to anyone, just stood there waiting for people to fill it briefly before moving on, the way certain lives do. He closed the truck door softly, as if afraid to wake something, and the sound echoed once and died. Snow crunched beneath his boots, that particular kind of January snow that squeaks when you walk on it, dense and dry, and each step felt like an apology he was making to the ground itself. The path to the door was barely visible, a suggestion more than a trail, and as he walked he saw the shape of his own childhood in the way the trees leaned, the angle of the roof, the stone chimney, standing crooked and stubborn against the years. He had left here at 17 with nothing but a duffel bag and a recruiter's promise, and he had not come back, not when the letters stopped coming, not when the wars ended, not when he finally had the time. But time, he had learned, was not the same as readiness. The door hung slightly open, its hinges red with rust, and when he pushed it the wood groaned like an old man rising from a chair. Inside, the air smelled of abandonment, mildew and mouse droppings and something faintly sweet that might have been rotting wood or might have been memory itself. He could not tell. Dust hung in the light from the broken window, turning slowly in place, and he thought of all the small eternities that live inside forgotten rooms, the way absence becomes its own kind of presence. There was a table still standing in the corner, one leg shorter than the others, and he recognized it the way you recognize your own face in an old photograph, familiar but impossibly distant. He set his bag down carefully, as if the floor might collapse beneath sudden weight, and he stood in the center of the room and let the cold seep into his bones. This was where his mother had made soup from nothing, where his father had sat silent and staring at walls only he could see, where he himself had slept curled beneath a wool blanket thin as paper, dreaming of warmth and elsewhere. The boy had been still lived somewhere in these walls, and the man he had become did not yet know if they could share the same space, or if one would have to forgive the other first. If this moment touches you, stay with us. These quiet stories need listeners like you. He walked to the fireplace, knelt down slowly because his knees were not what they once were, and he saw that someone, some animal, some passing stranger, had left a nest of twigs and dried grass in the hearth. He cleared it away with careful hands, his fingers stiff from the cold, and beneath it he found a single rusted toy soldier, no bigger than his thumb, painted green once but now almost colorless. He held it up to the light and turned it slowly, and he remembered buying it at a gas station with coins he had found beneath the truck seat, remembered how heavy it had felt in his small palm, how he had kept it in his pocket like a talisman against loneliness. He closed his fist around it and felt something crack open inside his chest, not pain exactly, but the place where pain had lived so long it had become part of the architecture. Outside, the light was already fading, the way it does in winter when the days give up early, and he knew he had work to do before darkness made it impossible. He went back to the truck and began unloading supplies, wood planks, nails, a tarp, canned food, a Coleman stove, blankets that still smelled faintly of the storage unit where he had kept them for years. He carried them inside, one armload at a time, his breath clouding in the air, his boots leaving dark prints on the dusty floor. And with each trip, he felt a little more like he was building something instead of just arriving at it. The cabin watched him the way old places do, patient and skeptical, waiting to see if he would stay or if he was just another person passing through, another ghost adding himself to the collection. By the time he finished, full dark had fallen, and the cold had teeth. He built a small fire in the hearth using newspaper and kindling he had brought, and he sat on the floor with his back against the wall and watched the flames catch and grow. The warmth spread slowly, reluctant but real, and the shadows danced on the walls like memories trying to take shape. He thought about all the years he had spent elsewhere, all the roads and battles and strangers' faces, and he wondered if a man could ever truly come home, or if home was just another word for the place you left behind. The fire popped and hissed, and somewhere outside a branch broke under the weight of snow. And he closed his eyes and let the exhaustion take him. There on the floor of the cabin, where he had been a boy, where he was now an old man, where something between those two versions of himself might finally learn to rest. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, and the cold crept back in from the corners of the room like something patient and inevitable, the way cold always does when you stop fighting it. He woke once, twice, his back aching against the hard floor, and each time he fed the fire another piece of wood and listened to the cabin settle around him. The creak of old beams adjusting to new weight, the whisper of wind finding gaps in the walls, the small anonymous sounds that old buildings make when they think no one is listening. He did not sleep deeply, had not slept deeply in years, but he drifted in that shallow place between waking and dreaming where the past and present blur together like watercolors left in the rain. When dawn finally came, it came gray and reluctant, the kind of winter morning that never quite commits to being day. He rose stiffly, his joints protesting, and he stood at the broken window and looked out at the world he had returned to. The snow lay smooth and unmarked except for the line of his own footprints from the night before, already softening at the edges, and beyond them the forest stood dark and silent, the trees like an audience waiting for something to begin. He thought he saw movement at the tree-line, a shadow, a shape, but when he blinked it was gone, and he could not be sure if it had been real or just his eyes adjusting to the light. He made coffee on the Coleman stove, bitter and strong, and he held the tin cup between both hands and let the heat seep into his palms. The cabin looked worse in daylight than it had the night before, the way things always do when you can finally see them clearly. The walls were stained with watermarks, dark balloon patterns spreading from the ceiling where the roof had leaked, and in places the floorboards had rotted through, showing the dark earth beneath. The window frames were swollen with moisture, the glass in one pane cracked in a perfect spiderweb, and everywhere he looked he saw work that needed doing, repairs that would take weeks or months or maybe longer. He did not let himself think about whether he had weeks or months. He just drank his coffee and watched the steam rise and dissolve. After a while he walked through the cabin slowly, running his hand along the walls, testing the floor with his weight, cataloging damage the way a doctor might examine a patient too far gone for easy fixes. In the back room, his room, once, though it seemed impossibly small now, he found a mattress rotted to springs and fabric scraps, and beneath it, folded and forgotten, a wool blanket he recognized, the same one he had slept under as a child. He pulled it out carefully and shook off the dust and held it up to the light. And though it was moth-eaten and stained, he could still see the pattern, dark blue and gray, and he could still feel the weight of it on his shoulders all those cold nights when warmth was a luxury and survival was the only prayer that mattered. He set the blanket aside and kept searching, not sure what he was looking for, but knowing he would recognize it when he found it. In the kitchen area, if you could call it that, just a corner with a rusted sink and a countertop that had buckled in the middle, he discovered a drawer that still opened, its runners squeaking with disuse. Inside were a few bent forks, a knife with a broken handle, a book of matches so old they might not strike, and beneath them, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been a dish rag, a photograph. His hands shook slightly as he unwrapped it, and when he saw the image, his throat tightened in a way that made breathing difficult. It was a picture of three people standing in front of this very cabin, in summer when the world was green and possible, and even though the photograph had faded to shades of brown and sepia, he knew every face. His mother, young and tired and trying to smile. His father, looking away from the camera as if already planning his departure. And between them, a small boy with serious eyes and a torn shirt, looking directly at whoever held the camera as if he could see through the lens and into the future, as if he already knew how this story would end. Maybe you found something like this too, in a place you thought you'd forgotten. If this story touches you, subscribe and let me know where you're listening from tonight. He sat down at the table with the photograph in front of him, and for a long time he just looked at it, trying to remember the day it was taken, the feel of the sun on his face, the sound of his mother's voice, anything that would make these strangers in the picture feel like people he had known. But memory is a strange country, and the longer you're away, the harder it is to find your way back. He could remember being cold, being hungry, being afraid, but he could not remember being loved, though surely he must have been, at least a little, at least sometimes. Surely that's why his mother had kept this photograph, why she had wrapped it carefully and hidden it away where time might not find it. The day passed slowly, the way days do when you're alone with your thoughts, and they're not particularly good company. He spent the afternoon clearing debris from the main room, sweeping mouse droppings and broken glass and fragments of things that had once been useful but were now just garbage. He worked methodically, without hurry, the way he had learned to do everything in life, one task at a time, one breath following another, no thought beyond the immediate action required. The physical labor felt good, made his muscles warm and his mind quiet, and for a few hours he was just a man cleaning a room, nothing more complicated than that. As the light began to fail again, he noticed something he had missed before, a small door, half hidden behind a piece of furniture that had collapsed against the wall. He moved the broken wood aside carefully, splinters catching at his gloves, and he pulled the door open. It led to a narrow closet, and inside, hanging from a nail, was an old coat, heavy wool with wooden buttons, and when he took it down and shook it out, he realized it had been his father's. He held it up and saw how small it was, how thin, and he understood for the first time that his father had been just a man, not a giant, not a monster, just a person who had worn a coat that was too light for winter and had left anyway. He put the coat on and found that it almost fit him now, that somewhere in all the years between then and now, he had grown into his father's size. The sleeves were a little short and the shoulders tight, but it was warm, and when he buttoned it and stood there in the fading light, he felt like he was wearing someone else's grief, someone else's failures, and maybe that was another kind of inheritance, the kind you couldn't refuse even if you wanted to. Night came again, as it always does, and he built another fire and sat watching it, the coat still buttoned around him, the photograph propped against the wall where he could see it. Outside, the wind picked up and snow began to fall again, soft and persistent, covering his tracks from the day before, erasing the evidence that anyone had come here at all. He thought about all the nights he had spent in other places, tents, barracks, cheap motels, park benches when money ran out. And he wondered if this was any different, if returning to the beginning meant anything at all, or if a man was just destined to keep moving in circles until the circles finally closed. The fire gave no answers, just warmth and light, and for now, for tonight, that was enough. Morning arrived with pale light and bitter cold, the kind that makes your bones ache before you even stand up, and the veteran rose from the floor where he'd spent another night, his back complaining, his joints stiff as rusted hinges. He had dreamed of nothing he could remember, or maybe he had not dreamed at all, and he was grateful for that small mercy. Dreams had a way of showing you things you had worked hard to forget, and he was too old now for lessons from the dark. He ate a breakfast of canned beans and stale bread, standing by the window while the light strengthened and the world outside took on definition. The trees becoming individual instead of just dark mass, the mountains revealing themselves layer by layer as the clouds lifted. When he finished eating, he washed the can and spoon in snow he melted over the stove, and then he put on the coat that had been his father's and the work gloves he had brought, and he went outside to begin the real work, the work of rebuilding what time and neglect had tried to take apart. The roof was the first priority, because without a roof, nothing else mattered, and he could see from the ground where shingles had come loose or blown away entirely, leaving patches of bare wood exposed to weather. He found an old ladder leaning against the side of the cabin, its rungs questionable, but still holding his weight when he tested them, and he carried it around to the back and set it carefully against the eaves. The climb was slow and deliberate, his breath clouding in the cold air, and when he reached the roof, he could see the full extent of the damage. Not catastrophic, but not trivial either, the kind of decay that happens when no one is watching, when a place is left to fend for itself against the elements. He worked through the morning, pulling loose shingles, hammering down the ones that could be saved, cutting pieces of tarp to cover the worst spots until he could make a proper repair. His hands remembered this kind of work, even if his body had forgotten, the muscle memory of construction and fixing and making do, and there was something almost meditative about it, the rhythm of hammer strikes, the rasp of saw teeth through wood, the way problems could be solved with enough patience and the right tools. From up here, he could see for miles, the forest spreading out in every direction, dark green and white and empty of any sign of human presence, except for the thin line of smoke rising from his own chimney. If this quiet work brings you peace, stay with us. We're building something here together, one story at a time. By noon, his hands were numb despite the gloves, and his shoulders burned from reaching and stretching, but he had made progress, had patched 3 of the worst leaks, and when he climbed down for lunch, he felt something he had not felt in a long time, a kind of satisfaction that comes from doing work that matters, even if it only matters to you. He ate more beans, drank more bitter coffee, and then he went back out because daylight was short this time of year and there was still so much to do. The afternoon he spent on the walls, inside and out, sealing gaps with strips of wood and old rags and anything else he could find, because every gap was a place where heat escaped and cold entered, and if he was going to survive the winter here, he needed to keep the warmth he made. He worked slowly, carefully, talking to himself, sometimes without realizing it, the way people do when they've been alone too long and the silence gets heavier than words. He talked about the war, about buddies he had lost, about the years after when he had drifted from place to place, trying to outrun something that lived inside him and therefore could not be escaped. He talked to his mother, to his father, to the boy he had been, and if the cabin listened or cared, it gave no sign, just stood there and let him work and accepted whatever he chose to give it. As the light began to fade, he noticed something at the edge of the clearing, movement again, and this time when he looked directly at it, he saw what it was, a dog, thin and rough-coated, watching him from the tree lean with amber eyes that caught the last of the day's light. It was not a large dog, maybe part shepherd, part something else, its fur matted and dark, and when he took a step toward it, the dog took a step back, maintaining the distance between them with careful precision. He stopped and crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening, and he spoke to it softly, the way you speak to frightened things that have learned to mistrust kindness. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough from disuse and cold. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog watched him, ears forward, body tense and ready to bolt. And for a long moment, they just looked at each other across the snow, 2 creatures alone in the wilderness, trying to decide if the other could be trusted. Then the dog turned and disappeared into the trees, silent as smoke, and the veteran stood up slowly and went back inside. But he left the cabin door unlatched, just in case. That night he built the fire higher than he needed to, letting it roar and crackle and fill the room with warmth and light, and he sat wrapped in the old blanket and ate his dinner and thought about the dog and whether it would come back. He knew what it felt like to be that way, watching from a distance, afraid to come closer, afraid to hope that anything good might be waiting. He had been that dog for years after he came home from the war, circling the edges of normal life, never quite able to step into it, never quite able to believe he belonged anywhere except on the outside looking in. Before he slept, he went to the door and opened it and looked out into the darkness. The snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared, and the stars were so bright they seemed close enough to touch, hard, cold points of light that had been shining since before his problems existed and would keep shining long after they ended. He called out softly to the night, to the dog if it was listening, and his breath hung in the air like a ghost of the words. "I'll leave something out for you," he said, "in case you get hungry." Then he went back inside and placed a can of beans on the porch, opened with a spoon stuck in it, and he closed the door and went to sleep with the knowledge that he had done one small kind thing. And maybe that was all anyone could do. Just keep doing small kind things until they added up to something that looked like a life worth living. The dog did not come that night. Or if it did, it left no sign except that the beans were gone and the can lay on its side at the edge of the porch, licked clean. The veteran found it in the morning when he went out to split firewood, and he smiled slightly, the first real smile he'd felt in days, and he set another can out before he went to work, this time with the lid only half removed so the dog wouldn't cut its tongue. The day was colder than the ones before, the temperature dropping until the air itself seemed to crystallize, and when he breathed out his breath, turned to ice in his beard. He worked anyway, because work was what kept you warm and sane and moving forward, and he spent the morning reinforcing the chimney with loose stones he found scattered around the property, mortaring them in place with mud and ash that would freeze solid and hold until spring. His hands went beyond cold and numbness, but he kept working because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering was a door he was trying very hard to keep closed. By afternoon, the sky had changed, the high pale blue darkening to something heavier, more ominous, clouds building in the west with that peculiar flat-bottomed look that means snow is coming. Real snow, not the gentle dustings of the past few days, but the kind that buries things and doesn't apologize. He had seen enough mountain weather to recognize it, and he moved faster, bringing in extra firewood, filling every container he had with snow to melt for water, checking the roof patches one more time to make sure they would hold. The wind picked up, coming in gusts that made the trees sway and the cabin groan, and the temperature continued to drop, and he knew he was running out of time. The storm hit just before dark, sudden and fierce, the wind howling around the cabin like something alive and angry, driving snow horizontally so thick he couldn't see the tree line anymore. He sealed the door as best he could, stuffing rags into the gaps, and he built the fire up high and settled in to wait out the way you wait out anything you can't control, with patience and resignation and a kind of grim faith that morning will come eventually, even if you can't see how. The cabin shook with each gust, and snow found its way inside despite his efforts, dusting the floor near the windows, and the temperature dropped until his breath was visible even next to the fire. He wrapped himself in every blanket he had, put on every layer of clothing, and still the cold worked its way in, persistent and patient and impossible to ignore. This was the kind of cold that killed people, he knew, the kind that made you want to sleep and then made sure you never woke up. And he kept moving, kept feeding the fire, kept flexing his fingers and toes to make sure the blood still flowed. Maybe you know this kind of cold, the kind that makes you understand how small you are. If this story is keeping you company tonight, let me know you're there, leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from, so I know these words are reaching someone. Sometime deep in the night, when the storm was at its worst and the world outside had disappeared entirely into white chaos, he heard something that wasn't wind. A sound, a voice maybe, or just the ghost of one. He stood up slowly, listening, and then he heard again, clearer this time, someone calling out, the words lost in the storm but the desperation unmistakable. He went to the door and opened it, and the wind nearly ripped it from his hands, and the cold hit him like a physical blow, but there, barely visible in the maelstrom of snow, was a figure stumbling through the drifts, a person, someone alive and in trouble. He didn't think, just reacted, years of training taking over, and he pushed out into the storm without his coat, without anything except the need to help, because that's what you did. You helped, even when it was stupid, even when it might kill you both. The snow was already knee-deep and getting deeper, and the figure had collapsed just at the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed them under the arms and started dragging them back toward the cabin, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning with cold air, and it seemed to take forever, seemed impossible, but somehow he got them to the door and inside and closed it against the wind. The stranger lay on the floor, gasping, covered in snow, shaking so hard their whole body convulsed. And in the firelight, he could see it was a young man, maybe 30, maybe younger, dressed in a jacket too thin for this weather and jeans soaked through. The veteran didn't waste time with questions, just started stripping off the wet clothes with numb fingers, wrapping the stranger in blankets, pulling him close to the fire, rubbing his hands and feet to restore circulation. The young man tried to talk, but his jaw was locked with cold, his teeth chattering too hard to form words, and the veteran just shushed him gently and kept working, doing what needed to be done. "Don't talk," he said. "Just breathe. You're safe now." He heated water on the stove and made the stranger drink it slowly, holding the cup because the young man's hand was shaking too badly. And gradually, over the course of an hour, color came back to the pale face, and the shaking subsided, and the stranger's eyes focused enough to see where he was. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin the fire held against the dark, and two men who had been strangers an hour ago now shared space and warmth, and the wordless understanding that survival is sometimes a group effort. "Thank you," the stranger finally managed, his voice hoarse and raw. "I thought I was going to die out there." "Maybe you were," the veteran said quietly, "but not tonight." They sat in silence for a while, the storm battering the walls, the fire crackling, and the veteran didn't ask questions because questions could wait, and right now the only thing that mattered was making it to morning. He gave the stranger more hot water, shared his food, offered the least ruined corner of the floor to sleep on, and when the young man finally drifted off, still shaking slightly under a pile of blankets, the veteran stayed awake and watched the door and listened to the wind and thought about how strange life was, how you could go days without seeing another soul and then suddenly be responsible for keeping one alive. Toward dawn, the storm finally began to ease, the wind dropping, the snow falling more gently, and the veteran allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment, just to rest them. And when he opened them again, pale light was coming through the windows, and the stranger was awake and sitting up and looking at him with an expression that was part gratitude and part something else, something harder to name. "I got lost," the stranger said, as if that explained everything. "I was hiking, and the storm came up so fast, and I couldn't find the trail." "If you hadn't been here, but I was," the veteran said, cutting him off gently, because he didn't want to think about the alternative, didn't want to imagine finding a frozen body in the spring thaw. "You're here now. That's what matters." The stranger nodded and looked around the cabin, taking in the poverty of it, the bare walls and rough floor and cobbled-together repairs, and the veteran wondered what he saw, whether he saw failure or survival, whether he saw a man hiding from the world or a man trying to rebuild his place in it. But the stranger just smiled, tired and real, and said, "You saved my life. I don't know how to thank you for that." "Stay warm," the veteran said. "Stay alive. That's thanks enough." The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow drifted so high against the cabin walls that the windows were half buried and the door would barely open. The veteran pushed against it with his shoulder, forcing it wide enough to slip through, and he stood on the porch and looked out at the silence. That particular quality of quiet that comes after a blizzard, when even the wind is exhausted and the forest holds its breath as if afraid to break the spell. The sun was trying to come through clouds thin to gauze, and the light had that strange flat brightness that makes everything look both closer and farther away than it should. The stranger, his name was Daniel, he'd said, though the veteran had not offered his own in return, had only nodded in acknowledgement, came to stand beside him, wrapped in one of the old blankets, his face still pale, but no longer the deathly white of the night before. They stood there together without speaking, two people who had shared proximity to dying and now stood on the other side of it. And there was a kind of intimacy in that, uncomfortable and unavoidable at once. "I should probably try to get back," Daniel said after a while, his voice uncertain. "My car's about 5 miles down the old logging road, if it's not buried. My phone died yesterday, and people will be worried." The veteran nodded slowly, looking out at the drifts, at the way the landscape had rearranged itself overnight into something unfamiliar and potentially treacherous. "Road won't be passable for days," he said, not unkindly. "You can try, but you'll be walking through hip-deep snow at best, chest-deep in places. And if the cold comes back tonight," he left the sentence unfinished, but Daniel understood well enough. He had been lucky once, stumbling into this cabin at the exact moment he needed to. Luck like that didn't usually come twice. "I can help you," Daniel said, turning to look at the cabin, at the work still evident everywhere you looked. "While I'm here, I mean. Least I can do, after you saved my life." The veteran wanted to say no, wanted to tell him they didn't need help, that he had gotten this far alone and could keep going the same way, but the truth was that another pair of hands would make the work go faster, and faster meant warmer, safer, more likely to survive whatever else this winter wanted to throw at him. So he nodded once, a small movement that cost more pride than he wanted to admit, and said, "All right, there's plenty to do. If someone once helped you when you needed it most, you know what that means. Stay with these stories, subscribe, and let's keep this fire burning together." They worked through the morning, the veteran teaching without quite teaching, showing Daniel how to bank snow against the foundation for insulation, how to split wood so it didn't bind the axe, how to move efficiently in cold weather so you stayed warm without sweating, because sweat would freeze and kill you just as surely as standing still. Daniel was clumsy at first, city soft and unused to this kind of labor, but he learned quickly and didn't complain, and the veteran found himself appreciating the company more than he expected to. The way conversation made the work feel lighter, even when the work itself was just as hard. At midday, they took a break, sitting on the porch steps in a patch of weak sunlight, eating beans cold from the can, because neither wanted to go back inside yet, not while the sun was out and the world looked almost beautiful in its frozen stillness. The dog appeared again at the tree line, the same amber-eyed watcher from before, and this time it ventured a little closer, maybe 20 feet away, its attention split between the men and the food. "Friend of yours?" Daniel asked, smiling. "Don't know yet," the veteran said. He broke off a piece of the bread he'd been eating and tossed it gently toward the dog. It landed in the snow halfway between them, and the dog approached cautiously, sniffed it, then grabbed it and retreated quickly back to its watching distance. "Takes time to build trust." "Yeah," Daniel said quietly, and something in his voice made the veteran glance over at him. But the young man was looking down at his hands, at the blisters already forming despite the gloves, and he didn't elaborate. That afternoon, they turned their attention to the inside of the cabin, and that's when they found it, the trapdoor hidden under the collapsed furniture in the back room, so covered in dust and debris that it looked like part of the floor until Daniel accidentally stepped on it and heard the hollow sound beneath. They cleared away the broken wood and mouse nests and remnants of things too decayed to identify, and there it was, a square cut into the floorboards with a rusted iron ring set into it, the kind of thing you'd miss unless you were looking for it. The veteran stared at it for a long time, something stirring in his memory, faint and uncertain, like trying to remember a dream after you've woken. He had been small when he lived here, 7 or 8 when his father finally disappeared for good, and there were whole parts of the cabin he'd been told not to go, places that were dangerous or private or just none of his business. Had this been one of them? He couldn't remember, but his hand were already reaching for the ring, pulling despite himself, curiosity or compulsion overriding caution. The trapdoor was heavy, swollen with moisture, and it took both of them to lift it, their combined weight barely enough to break whatever seal time had created. It came up slowly, grudgingly, and when it finally gave way, a smell rose from below. Earth and mildew, and something else, something dry and papery that might have been old wood or might have been something else entirely. Below, revealed in the dim light filtering through the windows, was a set of rough wooden steps descending into darkness, into a cellar he had not known existed, or had known once and forgotten the way children forget rooms in houses where they no longer live. Daniel found a flashlight in his pack, and the veteran took it and descended slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The beam of light swinging across dirt walls and a low ceiling supported by beams that looked questionable at best. The cellar was small, maybe 8 feet by 10, and at first it seemed empty, just a hole in the ground where someone had once stored root vegetables or preserved food, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. Wooden crates stacked against the far wall, and beside them, wrapped in what had once been a tarp, bundles of something he couldn't identify from the stairs. He stepped down onto the dirt floor, his head nearly touching the ceiling, and he approached the crates slowly, the way you approach things that might be fragile or dangerous or both. The first crate he opened was full of mason jars, their contents long since spoiled and unrecognizable, but the second held tools. Good ones, barely rusted, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them through the years. Saws, chisels, planes, a hand drill, the kind of tools a carpenter or craftsman would need, would value, would keep safe. The bundles turn out to be seeds, dozens of packets wrapped in wax paper and sealed in glass jars to keep moisture out, each one labeled in handwriting he thought he recognized but couldn't quite place. Beans, corn, squash, tomatoes, lettuce, herbs. Enough to plant a garden, a real one, the kind that could feed a person if they knew what they were doing. And beneath them all, at the bottom of the last crate, wrapped in a piece of canvas and tied with string, an envelope. His hands shook as he picked it up, as he climbed back up the stairs into the light, as he sat down on the floor and untied the string with fingers that suddenly felt too thick and clumsy. Daniel watched him silently, sensing something important was happening, and the veteran opened the envelope and pulled out a single piece of paper, folded and refolded until the creases were nearly worn through. And when he unfolded it, he saw his father's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years, and he began to read. The letter was short, the words simple, and they broke something open inside him that had been sealed shut for so long he'd forgotten it was there. His father wrote about failure, about being a bad husband and a worse father, about leaving because he couldn't stand to keep disappointing the people who needed him. He wrote about shame and fear and the paralysis that comes from knowing you're not enough and never will be. And then, in the last paragraph, he wrote about hope, about putting these things in the cellar, these tools and seeds, in case someday things got better, in case someday he could come back and start over, in case the boy he'd left behind might one day need something to build with. "I know I won't be there to help you," the letter said, "but maybe these will be. If you ever come back here, if you ever need to start again, you'll have what you need to do it. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more. I'm sorry I couldn't give you myself. But I try to leave you something that might last longer than I will." Your father, the veteran, sat there with the letter in his hands. And for the first time since he'd returned to this place, maybe for the first time in years, he let himself cry, quiet tears that fell onto the paper and blurred the ink, but didn't erase the words, couldn't erase them, because they were real and they'd been waiting here all along while he was out in the world learning how to survive everything except his own loneliness. Daniel looked away, giving him privacy, and after a while the veteran folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and slipped it into his pocket where he could feel it against his heart. He stood up slowly and looked at Daniel and managed a slight smile, tired but real. "Looks like I've got seeds to plant come spring," he said, his voice rough but steady. "And work to do before then." Daniel nodded, understanding that something had shifted, that whatever the veteran had found in that cellar was more than just tools and seeds, was permission maybe, or forgiveness, or just the knowledge that even people who failed you had tried, in their way, to love you as best they could. "Then let's get to it," Daniel said. "Winter's not done with us yet." Winter loosened its grip slowly, the way a fist unclenches after holding too tight for too long, and the days began to stretch themselves out a little more each morning, a little more each evening, until there was almost enough light to believe in something beyond survival. The snow started to recede from the edges of the clearing first, pulling back to reveal dead grass and frozen mud, and the shapes of things that had been buried. A fallen branch, a rusted bucket, the bones of a world waiting to be remembered. Daniel had stayed longer than either of them expected, the road remaining impassable for nearly a week. And by the time it finally cleared enough for him to leave, something had changed between them, some unspoken understanding that made the goodbye feel temporary rather than final. He had written his number on a scrap of paper and left it on the table, along with $200 from his wallet that the veteran had tried to refuse and couldn't, because pride is expensive and warmth costs money, and Daniel had insisted in a way that made refusal feel like ingratitude. "You call if you need anything," Daniel had said, standing by his car in the pale March sunlight, and the veteran had nodded and shaken his hand and watched him drive away down the rutted road until the truck disappeared around the bend and the sound of the engine faded into the general quiet of the forest. Then he had gone back inside and sat at the table with his coffee and the letter from his father still folded in his pocket, and he had allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite loneliness, because he had been alone before, and This was different, but a kind of pleasant melancholy that came from knowing that connection was possible. That people could still surprise you with their kindness, even when you'd stopped expecting it. The dog had stayed too, growing bolder each day until it would eat from a bowl set on the porch while the veteran sat nearby, not close enough to touch, but close enough to matter. He had started calling it dog because naming something properly felt like too much commitment, and he wasn't sure yet if the animal would stay or if one day it would just disappear back into the trees the way it had come, and he wanted to be prepared for that possibility. But each morning when he woke, the dog was there, curled on the porch or sitting at the edge of the clearing, and each evening it would eat whatever he offered and then settle in for the night within sight of the cabin. And gradually he stopped thinking about whether it would leave and started thinking about where it would sleep when the weather got warmer. If you've ever had something small choose to stay with you, you know what that feels like. If this story reminds you of someone or something you miss, leave a comment and tell me about it, so these words can hold that memory for a while. Spring arrived not all at once, but in pieces, a day of warmth followed by a night of frost, ice melting and reef freezing, the ground thawing and hardening again as winter argued with the coming season about who got to stay and who had to go. The veteran watched it happen from his porch each morning, watched the snow line climb higher up the mountains, watched the first green things push their way up through the dead grass, watched the birds come back in ones and twos, and then in flocks, their songs filling the silence with something that sounded like celebration or maybe just relief. When the ground finally softened enough to work, he took the seeds from the cellar and stood in the clearing south of the cabin where the sun hit longest, and he looked at the earth and tried to remember if he had ever planted anything in his life, if he had ever been responsible for something growing instead of just surviving. He couldn't remember doing so, but the packets in his hands had instructions written on them in faded ink, and he read them carefully, and then he began to work, turning the soil with one of the tools his father had left behind, a spade with a wooden handle worn smooth by hands he would never know. The work was hard, harder than he expected, because the ground was full of rocks and roots, and the accumulated resistance of years spent being nothing but ground. But he kept at it, one spadeful at a time, one row at a time, until his back ached and his hands were blistered, and he had cleared a plot maybe 20 feet by 30, small but sufficient a beginning. He raked it smooth, and then he made furrows with a stick, straight lines that wavered only a little, and he opened the first packet of seeds, beans, the label said, though the words were almost too faded to read, and he planted them the way the instructions described, covering them gently, pressing the earth down with his palm, as if he were tucking them in for the night. It took him 3 days to plant everything, working morning to evening, stopping only to eat and rest, and let his muscles recover enough to continue. And when he was finished, he stood at the edge of the garden and looked at the neat rows of dark earth and felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something that might have been pride, or might have been hope, or might have been the simple satisfaction of having done something that required faith in the future. He had planted things that would not grow for weeks, that might not grow at all if he did it wrong, or if the weather turned, or if luck decided to go some other direction. And that act of planting was itself a kind of prayer, a way of saying to the universe that he intended to be here when harvest came, that he believed there would be a harvest at all. The dog watched him from the edge of the garden, its amber eyes curious. And when he was done, the veteran sat down in the dirt, and the dog came closer than it ever had before, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if he'd wanted to. But he didn't, just sat there while the sun went down and the air cooled and the dog finally lay down a few feet away. And they stayed like that until the stars came out and the night grew cold enough to drive them both inside. Over the following weeks, he tended the garden with a diligence that surprised him, watering it from buckets he filled to the creek, pulling weeds before they could take hold, watching for the first green shoots to appear and feeling something like joy when they did, small and fragile and impossibly alive. The cabin work continued too, but slower now because the urgency of winter was gone and there was time to do things properly, time to plane the new board smooth and fit the windows tight and paint the door with paint that Daniel had brought on one of his visits because Daniel had come back, had driven up one Saturday in April with supplies in the back of his truck and a smile that said he'd been planning this, that he'd been thinking about the cabin and the work and maybe about the veteran himself, about whether he was still here or had given up and moved on. They worked together that weekend and the next, Daniel arriving early and staying late, and the veteran found that he looked forward to those visits, to the conversation and the shared labor, and the way having someone else around made the cabin feel less like a refuge and more like a home. Daniel never asked about the war or the years after or why the veteran had come back to this place alone, and the veteran was grateful for that silence, for the understanding that some stories didn't need telling, that some pain was private and should stay that way. By the time summer arrived properly, full and warm and generous with its light, the garden was thriving, the plants growing faster than he'd expected, their leaves dark green and healthy, and he had started harvesting lettuce and radishes, small things that matured quickly, and eating them felt like communion, like he was taking in not just food but proof that broken things could heal, that abandoned ground could become fertile again if you just gave it time and attention and believed that it deserved both. The cabin had been transformed too, not into something grand or impressive, but into something solid and weather-tight and comfortable, with windows that closed properly and a door that didn't stick and a roof that no longer leaked when it rained. He had built a proper bed frame from lumber Daniel had helped him mill, and he had found an old mattress at a yard sale in town and brought it back, and it was clean and firm, and sleeping on it felt like luxury after months on the floor. The porch had been rebuilt, the steps reinforced, and he had even made a railing so he could sit out there in the evenings without feeling like he might fall off into the dark. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you're finding peace in these stories, subscribe and stay with us, because there are more quiet tales to tell around this fire. The dog, still dog because some names stick even when you try to change them, had moved from the porch to inside the cabin, first sleeping by the door and then gradually migrating closer to the bed until one night the veteran woke to find it curled against his feet, warm and solid and trusting in a way that made his throat tight. He had reached down and touched its head for the first time, running his hand over the rough fur, and the dog had sighed and pressed closer, and he had understood then that this was it, that neither of them was leaving, that they had both found what they'd been looking for even if they hadn't known they were looking for it at all. One afternoon in July, when the garden was at its peak and the air smelled like growing things and sun-warmed earth, a truck came up the road, moving slowly, and the veteran stood on his porch and watched it approach with the dog at his side, no longer anxious about strangers but curious instead, alert. The truck stopped, and a woman got out, older than him by a few years maybe, with gray hair pulled back and a face that had seen weather and work and hadn't minded either. She walked up to the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at the garden and then at the cabin and then at him, and she smiled, small but genuine. "Didn't think anyone lived here anymore," she said. "Heard someone was fixing the old place up. Wanted to see for myself." "Just me," the veteran said. "And the dog?" "Well," she said, "we're doing a nice job of it. Place looks better than it has in 30 years. You planning to stay?" He thought about that question, about all the times in his life he'd been asked where he was going next, and had never had an answer, had never planned beyond the next day or week or month, because planning required believing you'd be around to see the plan through. And he looked at the garden and the cabin and the dog and the mountains beyond, and he realized that somewhere in the last few months, without noticing exactly when, he had stopped leaving and started staying. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." The woman nodded as if this made perfect sense, as if people came back to broken places and rebuilt them all the time. And maybe they did. Maybe he wasn't as alone in this as he'd thought. She introduced herself. Her name was Margaret. She lived 3 miles down the valley, had a small farm there, and if he ever needed anything, help or company, or just a reason to leave the mountain for an afternoon, he should come by. "We have a community dinner once a month," she said. "Nothing fancy, just neighbors getting together. You'd be welcome if you wanted to come." He almost said no automatically, the way he'd been saying no to invitations for years. But something stopped him, some part of him that remembered Daniel and the storm and the seeds his father had left and the dog sleeping by his feet, and he found himself nodding instead. "Maybe I will," he said. "Thank you." Margaret smiled wider then, and she got back in her truck and drove away, and the veteran stood on his porch and watched her go and thought about the word she'd used, neighbors, and how strange it was to think of himself as part of something, as connected to people and places and routines that extended beyond his own survival. But didn't feel bad, that strangeness. It felt like something he might be able to get used to, given time. August arrived with heat that softened the edges of everything, made the air thick and slow and full of the hum of insects. And the veteran spent his days working the garden in the early mornings and late evenings when the sun wasn't quite so fierce, and resting in the shade during the middle hours. The dog sprawled beside him, both of them moving as little as possible while the world baked around them. The harvest was coming in steady now, tomatoes and beans and squash, more than he could eat himself, and he had started taking the extra to Margaret's farm, trading vegetables for eggs and milk, and sometimes just conversation, standing in her kitchen while she made coffee and told him stories about the valley and the people in it, filling in the history of a place he was learning to call his own. He had gone to the community dinner in July, had driven down the mountain with his heart beating too fast and his hands tied on the wheel, but when he arrived, people had been kind without being intrusive, had welcomed him without demanding explanations, and he had sat at a long table in someone's barn and eaten food that other people had made and listened to conversations about weather and crops and whose roof needed fixing, and it had been almost easy, almost comfortable, like remembering how to do something you'd once been good at but had forgotten for a while. Daniel had come back several times over the summer, sometimes staying for a weekend, sometimes just for an afternoon, and they had finished the last of the big repairs and started on smaller projects, building shelves, constructing a chicken coop that the veteran wasn't sure he'd ever fill with actual chickens but liked having anyway, clearing a better path from the cabin to the creek. They had become friends, though neither of them used that word exactly, and the veteran had learned that Daniel worked in the city as an accountant, had been hiking alone that winter day because he'd been trying to clear his head after a breakup, and had gotten more than he bargained for in terms of both danger and salvation. "I think about that night a lot," Daniel said one afternoon while they were working on the chicken coop, measuring boards and cutting them to length. "About how close I came to just lying down in the snow and going to sleep. It would have been so easy, to stop fighting the cold and let it take over." The veteran nodded, because he had known that feeling more times than he could count, that moment when giving up stops being frightening and starts being seductive, when surrender looks like peace and you have to decide whether you're strong enough to keep choosing the harder path of staying alive. "But you didn't," he said quietly. "You kept walking." "Because I saw your light," Daniel said, looking up at him. "Through the trees, through the snow. I saw the smoke from your chimney, and I knew someone was there. And that was enough. That was all it took. If someone once saw your light when they needed it most, maybe you understand what I mean. Subscribe and stay with these stories, because sometimes that's all we have, the light we offer each other in the dark." They worked in comfortable silence after that, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, and when they finished for the day, they sat on the porch and drank cold water and watched the sun go down behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed impossible, too beautiful to be real, and yet there they were, happening anyway, indifferent to whether anyone witnessed them or not. The veteran had started sleeping better, had noticed it gradually over the summer, the way you notice seasons changing, not all at once, but in small increments, until one day you realize that something fundamental has shifted. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less frequently, and when they did, he would wake to find the dog pressed against him, warm and solid, and anchoring him to the present, and he would lie there in the dark and count his breaths and wait for his heartbeat to slow. And morning would come eventually the way it always did, patient and inevitable, and carrying with it the promise of work to be done, plants to tend, a life to be lived one day at a time. In early September, when the nights started to cool and the first hints of autumn appeared in the turning leaves, he made a decision that surprised him even as he acted on it. He drove into town, to the small feed store that also sold hardware and occasionally livestock, and he bought 6 chickens, hens laying birds red and brown and speckled, and brought them back to the cabin in a crate that fit in the truck bed, and he released them into the coop he and Daniel had built, and they settled in immediately, pecking at the ground and making soft burbling sounds that seemed like contentment or at least acceptance. The dog was fascinated by them, would sit for hours watching them through the wire mesh, but never bothered them, and the veteran found himself checking on them multiple times a day at first, making sure they had water and feed, and were adjusting to their new home, and it felt strange to be responsible for other living things, to have creatures depending on him for their survival, but it also felt right. like he was finally practicing for something larger than himself, learning how to be needed, without being afraid of failing. The first egg appeared 3 days after he got them, small and brown and still warm when he found it. And he held it carefully in both hands and felt something break open inside him, some final wall he'd been keeping between himself and hope. And he had to sit down on the ground right there in the coop because his legs wouldn't hold him, and he stayed there while the chickens pecked around him and the dog nosed at his shoulder with concern. And he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd done, of what he'd built, of the fact that he had come back to this place abandoned and broken and had somehow, against all reasonable expectation, made it into something that looked like paradise. Not paradise in the sense of perfection, not some Eden without struggle or pain or the memory of everything that had come before, but paradise is a place where you could rest, where you could plant things and watch them grow, where you could wake up each morning and know that today you would feed the chickens and water the garden and sit on the porch with your dog and watch the light change on the mountains. And that would be enough. That would be everything. That would be the kind of life worth living, even if no one ever knew about it except you. Maybe you've been building something like this too, quietly, when no one was watching. If this story touched you, tell me where you're listening from, and let's reach those 1,000 hearts by the fire together. Margaret came by in late September with a basket of apples from her trees and an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner. And he accepted both and thanked her, and she smiled and said she was glad he decided to stay, that the valley needed more people who knew how to work with their hands and didn't mind silence. After she left, he stood in his garden, now mostly harvested, the plants beginning to die back as the season turned, and he thought about how strange life was, how you could spend so many years running from something only to discover that what you needed was waiting at the place you started, patient and unchanged, holding space for you until you were ready to come back. That evening, he sat on his porch as the sun set, and the air grew cold enough to make his breath visible, and the dog lay at his feet, and the chickens settled in for the night with their soft clucking sounds, and from somewhere in the distance came the sound of geese flying south, their calls faint and lonely and beautiful. And he thought about his father's letter, still folded in his pocket where he carried it always. And he understood now what his father had been trying to say, what he maybe hadn't been able to say directly, that leaving something behind for someone you love is its own kind of staying, that even broken people can offer what they have, and sometimes what they have is enough. The stars came out one by one, then in clusters, then in great sweeping arcs across the sky, and he stayed on the porch until the cold drove him inside. And even then he stood at the window for a while longer, looking out at the garden and the coop and the trees and the mountains beyond, and he felt something he had not felt in so long he'd forgotten it had a name. He felt grateful, deeply and truly grateful, not for anything specific, but for everything together, for the accumulated weight of small mercies and second chances, and the stubborn persistence of life, finding its way back into places that seemed too damaged to support it. Before he went to bed, he wrote a letter, his handwriting rough and unpracticed, but legible, and he addressed it to Daniel, and in it he thanked him for staying that week after the storm, for coming back, for helping him build something worth having, and he said that if Daniel ever needed a place to rest or hide, or just be quiet for a while, the cabin would always have room for him, that there was enough here for 2 if it came to that, or 3, or however many people needed to know that they weren't alone, that someone was keeping a light burning, that home was still possible even after you'd given up believing in it. He sealed the letter and set it on the table to mail in the morning, and then he climbed into his bed with the dog at his feet, and the sound of the wind in the trees, and the chickens safe in their coop, and the garden sleeping under the stars. And he closed his eyes, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he fell asleep without being afraid of what dreams might come, because he knew that when morning arrived, he would wake up in a place he had built with his own hands, in a life he had chosen, in a paradise that had been waiting here all along, patient as the mountains, inevitable as spring, and he was finally home. If stories of quiet courage and second chances warm your heart, subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Our dream is to reach 1,000 hearts by the fire, and yours might be the one that makes the difference. Leave a comment and let me know which moment in this story touched you most, so I know these words are finding the people who need them. Thank you for sitting with me here, for listening to this story of a man who came home to himself, slowly, painfully, beautifully. Until we meet again by the fire, may you find your own way home, wherever that may be.